Why are you looking at me like that? You again? Why are you following me?
Amarachi.
Who said that?
Amarachi.
No, this cannot be happening. Did you just call my name?
Yes, Amarachi.
How do you know my name? Everyone in my house hates me. Sometimes she beats me.
The only place Amarachi ever found peace was the forest. Every morning, long before the sun rose high enough to burn the earth, she would quietly pick up the old rope basket her aunt had forced upon her and walk the narrow bush path that led away from the compound. The forest became her hiding place from the harsh world she lived in. It was the only place where the angry voice of her aunt, Nwakigo, could not reach her ears. The only place where she did not feel like the unwanted child everyone blamed for tragedies she never understood. One quiet afternoon, while Amarachi bent down to gather dry sticks for firewood, something unusual made her pause. She felt a strange sensation, the feeling that someone was watching her. Slowly she lifted her head and looked up. On a thick branch of a tall tree sat a bird. It was not fluttering like the other birds. It was not pecking at fruit. It was simply sitting there, watching her. Amarachi stared back at it with curiosity. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she murmured softly to herself, shaking her head before continuing to gather wood. When she finally lifted her bundle and left the forest, the bird remained on the branch, its eyes following her until she disappeared along the path. The next day, Amarachi returned to the forest again as usual. She had barely begun collecting firewood when she felt that same strange presence. Slowly she turned her head, and there it was again. The same bird. Sitting on the same branch. Watching her silently. Amarachi frowned. "You again," she whispered nervously. "Why are you following me?" She tried to ignore it, but something about the bird made her uneasy. Just as she bent to pick up another stick, a voice suddenly broke the silence of the forest. Amarachi. Her entire body froze. The bundle of firewood slipped from her hands and fell to the ground. Her heart began pounding loudly in her chest. She looked around quickly, fear rising in her throat. Who said that?" she asked, her voice shaking. The forest was quiet. The trees stood still. Then the voice came again, calm and gentle. "Amarachi." This time the sound came from above. Slowly, with trembling hands, she lifted her eyes toward the tree branch. The bird was still there, staring directly at her. Amarachi's eyes widened in shock. No, this cannot be happening," she whispered, taking a step backward. For a moment she almost turned and ran away. Everything inside her told her to flee. But strangely, something held her back. The bird did not look dangerous. Its eyes were calm, almost kind, as though it knew her deeply. Amarachi swallowed hard. Did you just call my name?" she asked slowly. The bird tilted its head slightly. "Yes, Amarachi," the voice replied gently. Her breathing became slow and careful. Fear still gripped her heart, but curiosity slowly began pushing the fear aside. "How do you know my name?" she asked. The bird did not answer immediately. Instead it simply watched her quietly. That strange silence somehow made Amarachi feel less afraid. Slowly, she sat down on a fallen log beneath the tree. "Everyone in my house hates me," she said quietly, almost without realizing she had begun speaking. "My aunt says I am a witch. She says I killed my parents. Her children laugh at me every day." The bird remained still, listening. Amarachi continued, her voice heavy with sadness. "Sometimes she beats me even when I did nothing wrong. Sometimes I go to bed hungry because there is no food left for me." A soft breeze moved through the trees. The bird finally spoke again. "Amarachi, tomorrow when you return home, do not break the clay pot in the kitchen." She blinked in confusion. Break the pot. Why would I break a pot? The bird said nothing more. Now, before we continue this powerful story, take a moment to support this channel by subscribing, because stories like this carry the wisdom of our ancestors. And trust me, you do not want to miss what is coming next. So grab your popcorn, sit back comfortably, because you are about to listen to an ancient folktale told by the greatest elders of the past. Now let me take you deeper into the story. Let us discover how this strange bird found Amarachi, who it truly is, how it knows her name, and whether it will save her from the cruelty of her wicked aunt. And by the time this story ends, powerful lessons will remain in your heart forever. This is the story of Amarachi and the strange bird. The story begins with a hardworking farmer named Obina, a gentle and respected man in the village. Obina was known everywhere for his kindness. If a widow struggled to clear her farm, Obina would be the first to appear with his cutlass and hoe. If a poor family had nothing to eat after a bad harvest, Obina would quietly share a portion of his own crops without expecting anything in return. People often said, if every man in this village had the heart of Obina, there would be no hunger among us. His wife, Adama, was a quiet and graceful woman who loved her husband deeply. She was 8 months pregnant with their first child, and the joy of motherhood shone gently in her eyes. Their compound was small, but it was filled with laughter, the kind of laughter that made neighbors smile whenever they passed by their gate. Every evening after returning from the farm, Obina would wash up, sit beside Adama on the wooden bench outside their hut, and gently place his hand on her round belly. "Little one," he would say joyfully, speaking to the child inside, "come quickly. Your father is waiting to carry you." Adama would laugh softly, shaking her head. "You have not even seen the child, and you already love it this much." Obina would smile proudly. "Whether it is a boy or a girl, the child will know peace in this house." They would sit there under the fading evening light, dreaming of the future that waited for them. But destiny was already waiting silently in the shadows. One morning, before the first rooster crowed, Obina rose quietly from bed and prepared for the farm. The sky was still dark when he picked up his tools. Adama stirred slightly as he stepped outside. "You are leaving already?" she asked sleepily. Obina walked back to the doorway and smiled. "Go back to sleep, my wife. Our child needs you strong." Adama placed a hand on her belly and nodded. "Come back early today," she murmured. Obina chuckled softly. "I will." Those were the last words she would ever hear from him. That morning, Obina walked alone along the bush path that led to his farm. The sun rose slowly, but Obina never returned home. By afternoon, whispers began spreading through the village. A group of hunters who had gone deep into the bush discovered something terrible. Obina's body lay on the ground near his farm, surrounded by broken plants and deep claw marks. Wild animals had attacked him while he walked alone. The hunters stood silently, their hearts heavy with grief. One of them shook his head slowly. "What a cruel fate," he whispered. The news reached the village like a thunderclap in a clear sky. People gathered in shock, their voices filled with sorrow. But no one knew how to tell Adama. Finally, a group of elderly women walked slowly toward Obina's compound. When Adama saw their faces, her heart began to tremble. "Mama Chinya," she said nervously, "why do you all look like this? Where is Obina?" The women exchanged sorrowful glances. One of them stepped forward and held Adama's hands gently. "My daughter, be strong." The moment the words left her mouth, Adama's body went weak. "No," she whispered, shaking her head slowly. "No, tell me he is safe." But the silence that followed told her everything. A terrible cry burst from her chest, a cry so deep and painful that it shook the entire compound. The shock struck her body like lightning. Suddenly she clutched her stomach and fell to the ground. "The baby," one of the women shouted. "She is going into labor." That night the compound was filled with worried voices as the women of the village gathered to help her deliver the child. The labor was long and painful. Adama screamed through the dark hours of the night as waves of pain crashed through her body again and again. The women held her hands, wiped her sweat, and prayed silently that both mother and child would survive. Outside the hut, men sat quietly in the darkness, speaking in hushed voices about the cruel turn of fate that had struck the young family. Finally, just as the first light of dawn touched the sky, the cry of a tiny baby filled the air. "It is a girl," one of the women announced joyfully. But the joy lasted only a moment. The woman turned toward Adama, who lay weak and pale on the mat. She slowly opened her eyes as they placed the tiny baby in her arms. For the first time, she looked at her child. A weak smile appeared on her lips. With trembling fingers she gently touched the baby's face. "My daughter," she whispered softly. Her voice was barely louder than the morning breeze. The baby moved slightly in her arms. Adama's eyes filled with tears of love. But then her hand slowly dropped. The smile faded. Her head tilted to one side. "Adama," one of the women called gently. Another woman touched her shoulder. "Adama." But Adama was gone. She had followed her husband into death, leaving behind the fragile life she had just brought into the world. The baby began to cry loudly in the arms of the woman. The sound echoed painfully inside the hut. One of the elderly women lifted the child carefully and looked at her tiny face. "This child will be called Amarachi," she said softly. "God's grace." The others nodded quietly. But outside the hut, the wind seemed to carry a different message. Because from that moment forward, grace would have to survive cruelty. After the burial of Obina and Adama, the elders of the village gathered quietly to decide the fate of the fragile baby left behind. In their tradition, a child could not be left without family, and since Obina had no parents alive, the responsibility fell upon the only blood relative remaining, his younger sister, Nwakigo. When the elders called her forward and placed the crying baby into her arms, Nwakigo's face hardened. She was a bitter woman whose heart had long carried silent jealousy. For years she had watched her brother's peaceful marriage with Adama, the laughter in their compound, the love they shared, and somewhere deep inside her, envy had grown like a thorn. Now she stood there holding the tiny child who had survived them both. She carried the baby reluctantly, her lips tightening in irritation as the infant cried loudly. She muttered coldly under her breath, rocking the baby without warmth. This child killed her parents before even opening her eyes to the world. One of the elders frowned. "Nwakigo, mind your words. The child knows nothing." Nwakigo shrugged slightly. Whether she knows or not, the truth remains. But she had no choice. The baby was now her responsibility. And so Amarachi was taken to live in Nwakigo's compound. From the very beginning, it was clear that she would not grow up like the other children in that household. Nwakigo had 3 children of her own: Fogochi, the proud first daughter who loved admiring herself in any shiny surface she could find; Ifioma, who followed her older sister everywhere like a shadow; and Obiora, the only son, who believed the entire world existed to please him. Nwakigo treated them like little kings and queens. Their clothes were always clean, their bowls always full, and their laughter always encouraged. But Amarachi's life was different. From the moment she was old enough to stand properly on her feet, she became the small servant of the house. At the age of 5, while other children played with sticks and rolled tires along the dusty paths, Amarachi was already sweeping the compound from one corner to the other. If she missed even a small patch of dust, Nwakigo's voice would thunder across the yard. "Amarachi, are your eyes blind? Sweep it again." At 6, Amarachi began fetching water from the distant stream. The clay pot often looked bigger than her small body, but she struggled with it anyway, her tiny feet walking carefully along the narrow path. At 7, she was already standing beside the cooking fire, learning to stir soup while smoke burned her eyes. If she made the smallest mistake, Nwakigo's anger would erupt like a storm. "You witch," she would scream loudly. "You killed your parents and now you want to destroy my house too." Amarachi would stand silently, her small hands trembling as she tried to understand what she had done wrong. The other children watched their mother closely and quickly learned her behavior. Soon they began copying her. Whenever Amarachi walked past them, Ugochi would whisper loudly to Ifeoma, "Look, the witch is coming." Ifeoma would burst into giggles. Even Obiora would join them, pointing at Amarachi and chanting mockingly, "Witch! Witch! Witch!" Amarachi heard the word every day, but she did not fully understand what it meant. All she knew was that whenever it was spoken, laughter followed, and somehow she was always the one feeling ashamed. Yet despite all the cruelty that surrounded her, something inside Amarachi remained soft and kind. Instead of growing bitter, she developed a quiet and gentle spirit that surprised anyone who truly looked at her. Sometimes when Nwakigo shouted endlessly in the compound, Amarachi would quietly whisper to herself while sweeping the ground. If shouting could cook soup, she murmured with a small smile, Aunt would be the richest woman in the whole village. Those tiny jokes she made to herself became her secret way of surviving. The goats in the compound slowly became her closest companions. While the other children chased them away or threw stones at them, Amarachi often sat beside them while doing her chores. She spoke to them as if they were human. One afternoon, while tying a small rope around one stubborn goat that kept wandering into the kitchen, Amarachi sighed dramatically. "Goat," she said quietly, "if Aunt shouts again today, we both will run away into the forest together." The goat suddenly bleated loudly, as if answering her. Amarachi burst into laughter. "Oh, so you agree with me," she teased. The goat bleated again, and Amarachi laughed even harder, holding her stomach. Those small, silly moments were the only light in her difficult childhood. They were tiny sparks of joy that kept her heart from breaking completely. And even though the world around her treated her like she did not belong, those little moments kept Amarachi alive inside. The only place Amarachi ever found peace was the forest. Every morning after finishing the endless chores her aunt forced upon her, she would quietly carry a rope basket on her back and walk down the narrow path that led deep into the trees. The forest became her hiding place from the harsh world she lived in. Out there, far away from the angry voice of Nwakigo and the mocking laughter of Ugochi, Ifeoma, and Obiora, Amarachi could finally breathe. The tall trees whispered gently as the wind passed through their leaves, birds sang freely above her head, and the earth felt soft beneath her tired feet. Sometimes she would even sit quietly on a fallen log before gathering the firewood, closing her eyes for a moment as if the forest itself was comforting her wounded heart. One quiet afternoon, as Amarachi bent down to pick up dry sticks scattered on the ground, a strange feeling crept over her. It felt as though someone was watching her. Slowly she lifted her head and looked around. Her eyes moved carefully from one tree to another until they stopped on a branch above her. A bird was sitting there. It was not hopping around like the other birds. It was not pecking at fruit or fluttering its wings. It was simply sitting there, watching her. Amarachi stared at it curiously. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she murmured softly, tilting her head. The bird did not move. It did not fly away. It just kept staring at her with calm, steady eyes. Amarachi shrugged slightly and returned to gathering her firewood. "You must be a strange bird," she whispered to herself with a small smile before lifting the bundle onto her back and heading home. The bird remained on the branch, watching until she disappeared into the trees. The next day Amarachi returned to the forest again as usual. She had barely begun picking up sticks when that same strange feeling returned. Slowly she looked up. The bird was there again. Sitting on the same branch. Watching her quietly. Amarachi frowned in surprise. "You again," she said nervously. "Did you follow me here?" She tried to ignore it and continued gathering her firewood, but the bird's eyes followed every movement she made. Just as she bent down to pick another stick, a voice suddenly broke the silence of the forest. Amarachi. Her entire body froze. The bundle of sticks slipped from her hands and scattered across the ground. Her heart began pounding loudly inside her chest. She looked around quickly, her breathing growing fast. Who said that?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. The forest was silent. No one stood behind the trees. No one walked along the path. Then the voice came again, calm and gentle. "Amarachi." Slowly, with trembling hands, she lifted her eyes toward the tree branch. The bird was still there, staring directly at her. Amarachi's eyes widened. "No, this cannot be happening," she whispered, taking a small step backward. For a moment she almost turned and ran away. Fear tightened around her chest. But strangely, something held her feet in place. The bird did not look dangerous. Its eyes were soft, almost kind, like someone who knew her very well. Amarachi swallowed nervously. Did you just call my name?" she asked slowly. The bird tilted its head slightly. "Yes, Amarachi," the gentle voice replied. Her heart beat faster. "But how do you know my name?" The bird did not answer immediately. It simply continued watching her quietly. Somehow that silence felt peaceful rather than frightening. Slowly Amarachi sat down on a fallen log beneath the tree, still staring up at the bird. Without even realizing it, she began speaking. "Everyone in my house hates me," she said quietly. "My aunt says I am a witch. She says I killed my parents even though I never met them." Her voice trembled slightly. "Sometimes she beats me when I make mistakes. Sometimes I go to bed hungry because there is no food left for me." The bird remained still, listening patiently as if every word mattered. Amarachi continued speaking softly. "I try to be good, but nothing I do ever pleases her." After a moment the bird finally spoke again. "Amarachi, tomorrow when you return home, be careful not to break the clay pot in the kitchen." Amarachi blinked in confusion. "Break the pot? Why would I break a pot?" But the bird said nothing more. The next day Amarachi remembered the strange warning and moved carefully around the kitchen while doing her chores. Later that evening, Obiora ran into the kitchen chasing a chicken and accidentally knocked the clay pot over. It shattered loudly on the floor. Nwakigo stormed into the room in fury. "Who broke my pot?" she shouted angrily. Obiora quickly pointed at Amarachi. "It was her," he lied. But Amarachi spoke quickly this time. "Aunt, I did not even touch it," she said calmly. For once, no one could prove she had done anything wrong. The beating never came. That night Amarachi lay awake thinking deeply about the strange bird in the forest. From that day forward, she began returning to the forest with a different feeling in her heart. The bird appeared almost every day, waiting quietly on the same branch. Slowly Amarachi began talking to it freely. She told the bird everything about her aunt's beatings, her hunger, her loneliness, and the pain she carried inside her heart. The bird always listened patiently. Sometimes it would warn her in its gentle voice. "Do not go near the well this evening. Stay away from the cooking fire today." And whenever Amarachi listened to those warnings, somehow trouble always avoided her. Days slowly turned into weeks, and deep inside her heart Amarachi began believing that this bird was not ordinary. It had become the only being in the whole world who truly listened to her. In a life filled with cruelty and loneliness, the strange bird had become her only friend. One bright morning, just as the villagers were beginning their daily activities, the deep sound of royal drums suddenly echoed across the entire village. The heavy rhythm rolled through the air like thunder, causing people to stop whatever they were doing. Farmers lifted their heads from their fields, traders stepped out of their huts, and children ran excitedly toward the village square. Everyone knew that when the royal drums sounded like that, it meant only one thing: the king had something important to announce. Soon the town crier stood in the center of the square, his tall staff raised high as the drum slowly faded into silence. In a loud commanding voice he spoke, "Hear this. Hear this. The king has spoken." The crowd leaned forward eagerly. The time has come for the prince of this kingdom to take a bride. A wave of excited murmurs rushed through the crowd immediately. Young maidens gasped and covered their mouths in excitement while their mothers exchanged hopeful glances. But the town crier raised his hand again for silence. However, he continued firmly, "There is a condition given by the gods themselves. The maiden who will become the prince's bride must first correctly speak the prince's name." The crowd suddenly fell quiet with confusion. The town crier continued, "Since the day the prince was born, his name has never been spoken before the people. Not even the palace servants know it. The chief priest warned the king and queen that the gods demanded secrecy. The prince's name must remain hidden until the day destiny reveals his bride. Only the maiden who calls him by his true name will marry him." The announcement spread through the village like wildfire. Women hurried home to tell their daughters, and the entire community buzzed with excitement and speculation. When Nwakigo heard the news, her eyes lit up immediately, shining with greed and ambition. She slapped her hands together and laughed loudly. "Huh! Finally, fortune has remembered my house," she exclaimed. Turning quickly toward her daughters, she declared proudly, "One of you will become a princess." Ugochi clapped her hands excitedly while Ifeoma jumped up and down with joy. "Mama, imagine us living in the palace," Ifeoma squealed. Nwakigo wasted no time. She rushed to the market and spent money she had been saving for years. She bought the most expensive wrappers she could find for Ugochi and Ifeoma, along with beautiful beads and shining ornaments. When they returned home, she spread the clothes proudly on the bed. "You must look more beautiful than every girl in this village," she said firmly. But when Amarachi walked quietly past the room, Nwakigo's expression hardened instantly. "You," she snapped sharply. Amarachi stopped nervously at the doorway. "Yes, Aunt." Nwakigo pointed a warning finger at her. "Listen carefully. If you go anywhere near that palace on the day of the gathering, I will break your legs." Amarachi lowered her eyes quickly. "Yes, Aunt." Nwakigo folded her arms and continued coldly, "While my daughters go to meet the prince, you will remain here working. In fact, I will give you so many chores that you will not even have time to think about the palace." And true to her word, she prepared a long list of tasks for Amarachi to do on that day. But Nwakigo was not satisfied with simply dressing her daughters well. She knew the most important thing was discovering the prince's secret name. Determined to find it, she began searching for anyone who might know. Her first stop was the palace gate, where a guard named Okari stood watch. Nwakigo looked around carefully before walking closer to him. She pulled out a small pouch filled with coins and waved it slightly. Okari's eyes immediately brightened. "Good afternoon, Mama," he said with a sly smile. "What brings you here?" Nwakigo leaned closer and whispered, "You work in the palace. You must know the prince's name." Okari hesitated for a moment. The truth was that he had absolutely no idea what the prince's name was. But when he saw the heavy pouch of money in Nwakigo's hand, greed quickly replaced honesty. He coughed lightly and straightened his shoulders. "Of course I know it," he said confidently. Nwakigo's eyes widened eagerly. "Then tell me." Okari quickly grabbed the pouch from her hand and slipped it into his pocket before speaking. "The prince's name is Abineis," he said boldly. Nwakigo gasped with excitement. "Abineis," she repeated quickly. "Yes," Okari replied firmly, nodding as though he was completely certain. Nwakigo left the palace smiling with satisfaction. But deep inside her greedy heart, doubt still lingered. What if the guard had lied? Determined to be completely sure, she decided to seek help from another source. Soon she visited a man known around the village as a powerful spiritual priest named Onika. The truth, however, was that Onika was nothing more than a clever trickster who made money by deceiving desperate people. When Nwakigo explained her problem, Onika leaned back and laughed slowly. "Oh, so you want the prince's name?" he said calmly. Nwakigo nodded eagerly. "Yes. My daughter must become the prince's wife." Onika stroked his beard thoughtfully before speaking again. "I know the prince's name," he said quietly. Nwakigo's face brightened instantly. "Then tell me," she demanded. Onika's smile slowly widened. "I will," he replied slowly. "But first, you must spend the night with me." Nwakigo froze. For a long moment she said nothing. Her pride battled with her greed inside her chest. But the thought of her daughter becoming a princess was too powerful. Finally, she looked away and spoke quietly. "Fine." That night she stayed with Onika. The next morning, as she prepared to leave, Onika stretched lazily and called after her. "The prince's name is Chukwudumebi," he said casually. Nwakigo repeated it carefully in her mind. Now she had two names, Abinais from the guard and Chukwudumebi from the fake priest. When she returned home, she called her daughters into the room. "Listen carefully," she said seriously. She turned to Ogochi. "When you see the prince, call him Abinais." Then she turned to Ifeoma. "And you, call him Chukwudumebi." Ogochi frowned slightly. "But Mama, which one is correct?" Nwakigo smiled confidently. "One of them must be the right name," she said. "And whichever of you says it first, will become the prince's wife." The long-awaited day of the royal gathering finally arrived, and from the very early hours of the morning the entire village buzzed with excitement. The narrow paths were alive with color as young maidens stepped out of their compounds wearing their finest wrappers, bright beads hanging from their necks and wrists, their hair carefully braided and decorated with ornaments that sparkled under the sun. Laughter filled the roads leading toward the palace as groups of girls walked together, whispering excitedly and teasing one another. "Today one of us will become a princess," one girl giggled. Another replied proudly, "Just make sure you don't faint when the prince looks at you." Mothers stood by their doorways smiling proudly as they watched their daughters disappear down the road toward what might become a life of royalty. But while joy filled the path to the palace, Amarachi walked in the opposite direction. Alone. Quietly. A rope basket hung over her shoulder as she made her usual journey toward the forest to gather firewood. Her dress was old and torn at the edges, the fabric faded from years of hard work. As she passed the groups of girls laughing on their way to the palace, some of them stared at her with surprise. One whispered to another, "Why is she going to the forest today of all days?" Amarachi lowered her eyes and continued walking without answering. Deep inside, her heart felt heavy. By the time she reached the quiet shade of the forest, the distant laughter from the village had faded. She slowly placed her basket on the ground and began picking up dry sticks one by one. After a few moments, a familiar flutter of wings broke the silence. Amarachi looked up. The strange bird landed gently on a nearby rock, its calm eyes watching her. "Amarachi," the bird said softly. She turned toward it and forced a small smile. "You came again." The bird tilted its head slightly. "Why are you not at the palace with the others?" Amarachi sighed deeply and sat on a fallen log, brushing dust from her tired hands. "My aunt said I must not go," she replied quietly. "She warned that if I go near the palace she will break my legs." The bird watched her silently as she continued speaking. "And even if I wanted to go, I do not know the prince's name like the other girls are trying to discover." She looked down at her dress and gently touched the torn fabric. "Besides, look at me. I have nothing to wear." The forest became quiet again for a moment as the bird studied her face carefully. Then the bird spoke calmly, its voice steady and certain. "You will go." Amarachi blinked in surprise. "Go," she repeated softly. "How can I go?" But before she could say another word, the bird suddenly spread its wings wide and flapped them strongly. A strange light burst into the air around Amarachi, bright and warm like sunlight breaking through clouds. The wind moved around her in soft circles, lifting the edges of her torn dress. Amarachi gasped and jumped to her feet as the light surrounded her completely. She looked down at herself in shock. The old torn fabric she had been wearing slowly transformed before her eyes, changing into the most beautiful royal cloth she had ever seen. The colors shimmered like woven gold under the sunlight. Her hair, which had always been tied simply, suddenly felt heavier. When she touched it, her fingers brushed against delicate beads that now decorated her braids, shining like tiny stars. Even her skin seemed to glow softly, as though she had never walked a single day in her life. Amarachi's mouth fell open in disbelief. What is happening?" she whispered. Slowly she walked toward the river that flowed beside the forest path and looked down at the water. The reflection staring back at her made her step backward in shock. The girl in the river looked like a princess. Amarachi touched her face carefully. Is that really me?" she whispered. Even she could barely recognize herself. Behind her, the strange bird watched quietly before speaking again in its calm voice. "Listen carefully, Amarachi." She turned quickly toward the bird. The bird continued, its voice now carrying a deeper weight. "The prince's true name is Prince Chibisdag I." Amarachi repeated the name slowly, making sure she remembered every word. "Prince Chibisdag I." The bird nodded gently. "When you reach the palace, call him exactly that." Amarachi's heart began beating with excitement and nervousness at the same time. For a moment she simply stood there staring at the bird, overwhelmed with gratitude and wonder. Then she whispered softly, "Thank you." And for the first time in her life, Amarachi turned away from the forest not as a servant girl, but as a maiden walking toward destiny. The palace courtyard was already crowded with maidens from every corner of the kingdom, each one dressed in her finest clothes, each one carrying the same dream in her heart, to become the prince's bride. The king sat on his royal throne beside the queen, watching patiently as the young women came forward one after another. At the center of the courtyard stood the prince himself, calm and dignified, his face revealing nothing. One by one the maidens stepped forward, their voices trembling with excitement as they attempted to speak the hidden name. "Prince Chokudi," one girl called confidently. The prince simply shook his head. "That is not my name." The crowd murmured as the girl slowly stepped away in embarrassment. Another maiden rushed forward eagerly. "Prince Abinais," she declared loudly. Again the prince shook his head. "That is not my name." The crowd sighed again. One after another they tried. "Prince Chinidu. Prince Okachuku. Prince Namdi." Each time the prince calmly replied, "That is not my name." The attempts continued until the afternoon sun began to drop slowly across the palace walls. The king shifted tiredly in his throne, rubbing his forehead with frustration. "How can none of them know the name?" he muttered quietly. The queen sighed beside him. "Perhaps the gods have not yet brought the chosen one." Meanwhile, standing among the crowd were Nwakigo and her daughters, Ugochi and Ifeoma. Nwakigo's eyes burned with impatience as she pushed her daughters forward. "Go," she whispered urgently. "Say the names I told you." Ugochi stepped forward first, lifting her chin proudly. She faced the prince and called loudly, "Prince Abinais." The prince looked at her calmly and shook his head. "That is not my name." Ugochi's confidence collapsed instantly as embarrassed whispers spread through the crowd. She quickly stepped back. Nwakigo grabbed Ifeoma's arm roughly and pushed her forward next. "Say the other one," she hissed. Ifeoma swallowed nervously before speaking. "Prince Chokudumebi." Again the prince shook his head slowly. "That is not my name." Nwakigo's mouth fell open in disbelief. Her hands began trembling with anger as she realized the terrible truth: both the palace guard and the fake priest had deceived her. "Those thieves," she muttered furiously. "They took my money. The final maidens finished their attempts, and still no one had spoken the correct name. The king leaned back in exhaustion. Perhaps this gathering must end, he said sadly. The prince nodded slightly and turned his back, preparing to walk away from the courtyard. Just as he took his first step, a clear voice suddenly rang through the palace gates. Prince Chibizdek the first of Oma Kingdom. The entire courtyard fell into complete silence. Even the wind seemed to pause. Slowly the prince stopped walking. His shoulders stiffened before he turned around. The king froze in his throne, his eyes wide with shock. The queen covered her mouth as a loud gasp escaped her lips. At the entrance of the courtyard stood Amarachi, glowing like sunlight in her beautiful royal fabric, her beaded hair shining as she walked forward with quiet confidence. The prince stared at her in stunned silence. She stepped closer and bowed slightly. Prince Chibizdek the first of Oma Kingdom, she repeated respectfully. May your reign be blessed. The crowd erupted into shocked whispers. Nwakigo's eyes widened in horror as she recognized the girl standing before the prince. Amarachi, she screamed. Rage exploded inside her chest. She pushed through the crowd furiously and rushed toward the center of the courtyard. That thief, she shouted loudly. She stole my money to buy those clothes. She stretched her hand forward, trying to grab Amarachi roughly. Come here, you wicked girl. But before she could touch her, the prince suddenly raised his hand sharply. Stop. His voice was calm but powerful. Immediately the palace guard stepped forward and blocked Nwakigo's path. She struggled angrily against them. Leave me. She is my servant. But the prince ignored her completely. Instead, he slowly walked toward Amarachi. When he reached her, he looked directly into her eyes. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The entire courtyard watched in silence. And in that single moment, something changed in the prince's heart. The gentleness in Amarachi's eyes, the quiet strength in her presence, the courage it took for her to stand there alone before the entire kingdom, it captured him completely. Without saying a word, the prince gently took Amarachi's hand. Murmurs spread through the crowd immediately. On the royal throne, the chief priest slowly stood up, a knowing smile appearing on his face. He lifted his staff and spoke in a calm, powerful voice. The gods have spoken. The courtyard fell silent again as his words echoed through the air. The maiden who knows the prince's name has arrived. Destiny has chosen her. The king slowly rose from his throne, still amazed by what had just happened. The queen's eyes filled with tears of joy. Nwakigo collapsed onto the ground in disbelief as the guards dragged her and her daughters away from the courtyard. No. This cannot be happening, she cried desperately. But the palace gates closed behind them, leaving them outside in shame. Inside the palace, the prince still held Amarachi's hand. And from that moment forward, the orphan girl who had once been treated like nothing, became the chosen bride of the prince. Not long after the celebrations in the palace had settled, Amarachi remembered the one being who had stood by her when the world treated her like nothing. One quiet afternoon she left the palace grounds and walked down the familiar path toward the forest, the same forest that had once been her only place of peace. The tall trees swayed gently as the wind moved through their branches, and the soft sound of birds echoed in the distance. Amarachi stepped carefully along the path until she reached the very spot where she used to gather firewood and speak to the strange bird. She looked around slowly, her heart filled with gratitude. My friend, she called softly, her voice echoing gently among the trees. I came to thank you. For a moment the forest remained quiet. Then suddenly the familiar flutter of wings broke the silence. The bird appeared and landed gently on the branch of the same tree where Amarachi had first seen it. Amarachi smiled with relief as she stepped closer. You see, she said warmly. Everything you told me came true. I would never have reached the palace without you. The bird watched her silently for a moment. Then something extraordinary began to happen. The bird slowly spread its wings, and a strange light surrounded it just as it had done the day it transformed Amarachi's clothes. Amarachi's smile faded into confusion as the bird's form began to change before her eyes. The feathers slowly dissolved into light, the wings stretched and reshaped, and within moments the bird was gone. Standing before Amarachi was a beautiful woman, glowing softly in the quiet forest light. Amarachi gasped sharply, taking a step back in shock. But as she looked into the woman's gentle eyes, something deep inside her heart stirred. A strange warmth filled her chest, the kind of feeling a child knows even without explanation. Her lips trembled slightly as the realization washed over her. "Mother," she whispered softly. The woman smiled gently, her eyes filled with love. It was Adama. The spirit of the mother Amarachi had never known had been watching over her all along. Amarachi stood frozen, overwhelmed with emotion as tears slowly filled her eyes. Adama stepped closer and placed a gentle hand on her daughter's cheek. "My daughter," she said softly, her voice calm and warm like a distant lullaby, "my time here is over." Amarachi shook her head slowly, tears beginning to fall. "All this time, it was you," she whispered. Adama nodded. "When I died, I could not leave you alone in this world. I begged the head spirits to give me one chance to protect you, to guide you until you found your happiness." Her gentle smile grew brighter. "And now I see that you have found it." Amarachi tried to speak but her voice broke with emotion. "Mother, don't go." Adama's hand remained on her cheek. "My daughter," she said tenderly, "I am happy now. Seeing you safe and loved is all the peace I needed." Then her expression became serious for a moment as she gave Amarachi one final instruction. "Remember this always. Never allow cruelty to grow in your heart. Forgive those who hurt you." Amarachi wiped her tears slowly as she listened. "Even my aunt?" she asked quietly. Adama nodded gently. "Yes. Forgive them. Kindness will always be stronger than bitterness." The forest breeze suddenly moved through the trees again, and the soft light surrounding Adama began to fade. Amarachi's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. "Mother, wait," she cried softly. But Adama only smiled peacefully. "Be happy, my daughter," she whispered. And then, just like that, her form dissolved into the air and disappeared among the dancing rays of sunlight. Amarachi stood there silently for a long time, the quiet forest surrounding her once again. A single tear rolled down her face, but this time she wiped it away gently, carrying a peaceful smile in her heart. True to her mother's final words, Amarachi chose kindness over revenge. Instead of punishing Nokigo and her cousins for all the suffering they had caused her, she forgave them. She helped them rebuild their lives and showed them the same kindness they had once denied her. The people of the kingdom admired her deeply for her compassion, and her story became a lesson told across many generations. In time, Amarachi gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. When the child was placed in her arms for the first time, Amarachi smiled softly and whispered the name she had carried in her heart for so long. Adama. She named her daughter in honor of the mother who had never stopped loving her, even from beyond the world of the living. And so the story ends with a truth that echoes through the wisdom of the elders: kindness is stronger than cruelty, destiny cannot be stolen, and a mother's love never truly dies.